Growing up in a small town nestled at the foot of rugged mountains, life had always been a mix of hard work and quiet simplicity. My family lived on the outskirts where our neighbors were sparse but the winters were harsh. My father was a coal miner, and my brother JT and I inherited his sense of grit and determination. After our father's passing, we took on the responsibility of maintaining the family home, an old structure that had more personality than practicality. Our mother, ever strong-willed, insisted we keep the coal stove burning, a tribute to Dad's memory, despite JT's attempts to modernize. Years later, the world around me had moved on, but I stayed rooted in my small-town routine. I'd tried my hand at various jobs, but always found myself returning to the simplicity of the mountain roads and the warmth of the coal stove on a snowy evening. Writing was my passion, though it rarely paid the bills. Most people I knew had moved to the city, leaving the quiet of this place behind. My life might have seemed uneventful to an outsider, but I found comfort in its predictability, until that late-night phone call disrupted everything. A faint chime echoed through the room, slowly pulling me out of a restless sleep. Even in my half-conscious state, I sensed something wasn't right. It didn't take long to figure out that it was the phone ringing. With a groan, I stretched out and blindly reached for it on the floor beside my bed, which, if I was being honest, probably hadn't been touched in days. No one called me anymore. Everyone preferred to send emails instead. I heard a voice crackle through the receiver, introducing itself as Finn. The name barely registered at first, but then he added something about being a tow truck driver. I was starting to wish I hadn't picked up. When I didn't respond, he pressed on, asking if I remembered him. I groaned again. "Yeah, sure, Finn. What's going on?" I didn't say it out loud, but I was already thinking, this better be worth my time. Finn explained that it was an emergency. I rubbed my eyes in frustration, asking what time it was. When he said just past midnight, I felt a little less annoyed. It wasn't that late, but still I wasn't thrilled. "If you don't have a damn good reason for calling at this hour," I trailed off, hoping my impatience was obvious. He quickly got to the point. Apparently, he remembered that I was short on cash and had nothing planned for tomorrow, so he thought of me. I wasn't sure if I should be flattered or insulted. "What do you want me to do at midnight?" I asked, my patience thinning. Finn's request was simple but strange. A woman driving a fancy Mercedes had ended up stuck in a ditch about a mile off the highway. The highway patrol had called him in to tow her out. She was in a hurry to get to Ashley, and he couldn't think of anyone else who'd be willing to help at this time of night. "How many people have already said no?" I asked, already knowing I wasn't Finn's first choice. I barely knew the guy. "A couple," he admitted. "John Thomas thought you might come through." John Thomas was my brother, and he probably assumed I could use the money. But right now, what I really needed was sleep. Still, I was awake now, so I might as well hear him out. "Who is this woman?" I asked, already dreading the idea of leaving the warmth of my bed to go out in the cold. "She's driving one of those high-end sedans, a Mercedes. Apparently she mistook the ditch for a snowplow and drove straight into it. Now she's stuck. The roads are pretty bad out there too. There's about a foot of snow in some places, and she doesn't even have snow tires on that car. Looks like the fender's gonna need to be pried off and the tires shot. The highway patrol asked me to pull her out, but she insists she has to get to Ashley right away." "Why the rush?" I asked, skeptical. There was nothing in Ashley that would make a trip there worth hurrying for. Finn hesitated. "I think it's something with her kid. She's got a kid at that special school over there." That made me pause. I didn't know what was going on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was one of those moments where you just had to help, no matter how inconvenient it was. The school in question was a private boarding institution, marketed to the wealthy and talented, or so its brochure claimed. I asked where she was, bracing myself for the trip out in the snow. Her response, she was at my brother's garage, waiting in the truck with the engine running to stay warm. She suggested I hurry up. I had no doubt that Finn, my brother, was eager to pass the responsibility off to me. He didn't want to be the one to deliver the bad news. I grabbed the phone, and a calm, confident voice answered. I introduced myself as Lucas Hayes, and told her I'd try my best to get her to Ashley, though the snow might force us to turn back before we got there. She asked if I had a Jeep, and I explained I had a four-wheel drive, but that it wasn't a guarantee we'd make it through if the snow piled up in drifts. She pressed on, asking if that was likely. I assured her it wasn't, but added it was still a possibility. She thanked me for my honesty, but insisted on getting to Ashley. I warned her that it was past midnight, and by the time we got there, the school would probably be locked up. I suggested Finn take her to a motel nearby, and we could try again in the morning when the office opened. She countered that the headmaster was expecting her and would surely let her in. I wished her luck and told her to dress warmly, as anything could happen on the road. She assured me she would be fine, and I told her I'd be there in about 20 minutes. She asked if I could come sooner. I guess she didn't want to sit alone in Finn's truck, though she was safe enough there, even if she didn't know it. I told her I had to get dressed and drive down treacherous roads, and that 20 minutes was the best I could do. The truth was, I didn't even want to leave the comfort of my warm bed. I'd agreed only because JT, my brother, would have been really upset if I hadn't. He owned the other half of the shack where I lived, and I didn't want to make him angry. JT never asked for rent, though he could have. He didn't need the money, but still, I didn't want to risk him deciding otherwise. The coal stove in the shack was still burning, keeping the place warm enough. The fire had been a fixture ever since our father, a coal miner, passed away. Afterward, JT and I had installed running water, something we never had while our parents were alive. JT had wanted to switch to oil heat, but Mom had refused, insisting it would dishonor Dad's memory. That stove, like everything else in that house, was a reminder of the past. I moved quickly through the small space, a room that served as the kitchen, living room, and workspace. I filled a pan of water from the copper container perched above the stove, making sure it stayed warm without boiling. It was part of my morning routine, along with clearing the ashes and making sure the stove was ready for the day. I boiled water in an electric kettle while the stove warmed the room. Once the room started to heat up, I got moving, finishing up my tasks. When the water was warm enough, I took a quick wash using the kettle, waiting for the water to boil for my coffee. Then, I brewed a pot, using a funnel and a paper towel over a carafe I'd picked up from a defunct restaurant. I didn't have much time, but I toasted some bagels, ate them with jelly, and sipped my coffee. I was running late, but with the snow falling harder now, it was going to be a long night. After a 10-minute drive down the mountain, I pulled into Finn's auto shop. I was only 10 minutes behind schedule, but Finn looked irritated, as if 10 minutes in a warm truck should have made a bigger difference to me. He climbed out, clearly relieved to leave the truck, but still annoyed. The woman asked if someone could help her with her bags. Finn snapped at me to do it, making it clear he was done dealing with her. He didn't even try to whisper, as if he wanted her to hear how fed up he was. I agreed to help, telling her to hold on. She responded, asking me to hurry, her tone a little sharper than necessary. I was already regretting taking the job. Before I moved her bags, I asked Finn if they'd settled on my payment. He muttered that he just wanted her out of his life. I gave him a look, shaking my head, and got to work. I walked to the back of her car, parked by the shop door, and noticed the trunk was open with the light on. It illuminated her face, but not clearly. Her hair was hidden under a knit cap, and her body was wrapped in a thick down coat. In the dark, it was impossible to tell if she was model thin or bulky. But her face was slender, suggesting she wasn't overweight. Finn, however, treated her like trouble, and she seemed totally unaware of it. That kind of indifference could mean she was trouble herself, someone who didn't care what others thought. If that was the case, this drive to Ashley was going to be difficult. I grabbed 2 suitcases and slipped them into the back of the Samurai, securing them under the cloth cover. When I turned around, I started to bring up the payment. Before I could finish, Finn sped off, leaving me stuck with her, no agreement made. I was fuming. We'd be having a talk when I got back. She asked if I was a licensed taxi service. I couldn't believe it. I explained that her insurance wasn't my problem, and my only concern was getting paid for this middle-of-the-night drive. Since she seemed hesitant, I told her I expected payment up front. After a moment's hesitation, she asked if I took MasterCard. I couldn't help but laugh. She seemed to think I was running a taxi service, and her suggestion was absurd. She kept digging through her wallet, but I wasn't having it. "I want cash," I told her. "You're telling me you don't carry any?" She admitted she didn't carry much cash, which only made me more frustrated. I asked if she had $100, and after some searching, she found it. As I stood there in the cold, hands stuffed in my jacket, I realized we were both going to be drenched if we didn't move soon. She reluctantly agreed to get into the Samurai to finish the transaction. As we settled in, I started the engine and turned on the heat. It wasn't much, but it would help keep us from freezing. I set the defrost to keep the windshield clear as I prepared for the long drive ahead. The woman removed her knit cap, revealing very blonde, neatly styled hair. Her appearance suggested wealth, but I wasn't interested in engaging with her on that level. I tried to focus on the road, reminding myself that she probably wasn't interested in someone like me anyway. It was easier that way. She broke the silence by asking what I did for a living. I could tell it was a way to pass the time, so I replied that I was a struggling writer. She didn't offer much in return, only saying she worked in banking. I made a joking comment about her fancy car, but she missed the humor completely. She corrected me, saying she wasn't a teller, but I had already guessed that. There was something about her that wasn't quite adding up. She said she didn't want to talk about herself, and I figured that was fair enough. Most people enjoy talking about themselves, but she didn't seem to be one of those people. I wasn't sure what she wanted from this conversation, but I didn't push it. She said, "If you haven't already, you might want to notice that I'm not most people." I couldn't resist a smirk. "Oh, I noticed," I said. She asked if I'd noticed in a good way, and I glanced at her, unsure of her tone. I smiled, though. "Not yet." She made a subtle move, the kind of thing women do without much thought. Without shifting her position, she undid her coat and slid it off, though she remained sitting on it. The coat no longer covered her body, but she didn't seem to mind. I dared a quick glance at her, but the road required my attention. I couldn't afford to take my eyes off it for too long. From what I saw, she looked like she might be a year or two older or younger than me. It was hard to tell with her face lit by the faint glow of the dashboard. Her body appeared average, though maybe a bit fuller around the hips than what might be considered ideal. But then again, I wasn't exactly built like a bodybuilder, so an extra inch here or there didn't bother me. She finally spoke, her voice softer than before. It seemed like she was starting to relax, or perhaps just settling down. She mentioned, almost as an assumption, that I probably regretted taking the job. I wasn't sure if it was a statement or a question, but either way, she sounded a bit calmer. I didn't respond directly, choosing instead to explain that I always told the truth, one of the few things I'd learned from my family. I smiled at the windshield, hoping she'd see it, though I wasn't sure if she did. She didn't seem to be looking at me much. Her next words were pointed, acknowledging my lack of diplomacy. She seemed to take it in stride, though, and quickly moved on to the fact that while she knew my name, I didn't know hers. She didn't wait for me to answer, and when I didn't, there was a brief moment of tension before I tried to press her for an answer. I apologized for not hearing her the first time, then repeated my request. She acknowledged my question but didn't immediately respond. Instead, she seemed to deliberate whether to give me her name. I pressed a little harder, suggesting she could simply make one up if she didn't want to give me her real name. It wasn't like I expected her to be truthful, I just needed something to call her. Her response was measured, asking me not to use a certain word, but it didn't sound as if she was truly upset. It was more like a suggestion, one she probably wasn't expecting to be ignored, but I wasn't about to play along with that request. I decided to disregard it and told her I assumed she was an adult and capable of ignoring a little offensive language. She expressed that my words and attitude were frightening, but I wasn't convinced. I reassured her that she was safe. After all, too many people knew where she was, and I wasn't about to let anything happen to her. Still, she was reluctant to give her name. Eventually, she relented, offering me just her last name, Moore. I assumed it was Mrs. Moore, and she confirmed it without much elaboration. I shifted the conversation back to the matter at hand, whether she had a backup plan if the headmaster didn't show up. She seemed confident that she wouldn't need one, explaining that she paid the school a lot of money to educate her niece, and she trusted they would handle any issues, even if she had car trouble. I had to admit she probably had a point. We would find out soon enough, though. The drive to the school had taken longer than expected. The road was treacherous, and the silence in the car had stretched out over an hour and a half, making the short trip feel far longer. When we finally arrived, I pulled into the driveway and stopped several feet from the intercom. Mrs. Moore stared at the gate, her eyes distant, as if she was already mentally preparing for the next step. I broke the silence, asking her what her plan was. She hesitated before suggesting she try the intercom, but it wasn't clear if she was asking me or herself. I encouraged her to do it. After all, it seemed like the obvious first move. As soon as she opened the door, a sudden chill hit the car, and she quickly wrapped herself back in her coat before stepping outside. I stayed put, watching her approach the intercom and press the button. She shifted from foot to foot while waiting, but when no one answered, she came back to the car, frustrated. She got in quickly and slammed the door shut. Her irritation was palpable. It was clear no one had responded, and she let out a curse. I reminded her that it was well past 2 in the morning, and in a small place like this, people didn't stay up late waiting for calls. They knew I was coming, but they were probably all asleep by then. I suspected they had figured she'd be delayed and wouldn't expect her to arrive this late. She cursed again, clearly annoyed, but the tension in her voice had shifted. It wasn't just frustration anymore, it was more personal. I couldn't help but notice the change. She was still angry, but it felt like something deeper was at play. I asked about her backup plan again, and she snapped back, saying she would call the headmaster. I asked if she had his private number, knowing full well that his office phone was probably turned off for the night. She didn't have an answer right away, and she pressed on with her questions, wondering if there were some sort of emergency. I couldn't help but point out that in my family, if there was an emergency, we didn't call anyone. We just walked down the hall and dealt with it ourselves. She took offense to my comment, her anger flaring as she demanded to know what I meant by it. I could tell that her irritation was growing, but there was something more behind it now. She was getting emotional. I told her in no uncertain terms that she didn't know anything about me or my family, and I meant it. The words stung, but they were true. My family was different, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. Her eyes watered, and I realized then that she was genuinely upset, though I wasn't sure if it was because of what I said or something else entirely. But in that moment, I also knew I had made my point. We took care of our own, and we didn't send them off to be looked after by strangers. I was starting to lose my cool. People knew me as someone who could think clearly, even when I was furious, and I was about to test that reputation. The woman in the car had pushed all my buttons. She accused me of thinking my lower income gave me all the answers to life's problems. But I wasn't backing down. I shot back with some sarcastic remarks, poking fun at her city attitude, but it only seemed to upset her more. She was on the edge, her frustration building as she snapped about the price I charged for the ride. I wasn't about to let her get away with that, so I pointed out that if I really wanted to take advantage of her, the price would have been far higher. She asked what the fare would have been if her car hadn't broken down, but I insisted it would have been the same. This wasn't personal, it was just business. The tension was thick. She was angry at the school, at me, at the world, and I had no patience for it. Finally, in the midst of the verbal sparring, she broke down. It wasn't a few sniffles, it was a raw, gut-wrenching sob that seemed to tear through her. I let her cry it out until she regained some composure. I suggested we grab a cup of coffee to calm her down, though I wasn't exactly sure where we could go at this hour. The town was tiny, and everything was closed. I drove slowly through the old mining village, passing places that looked like they hadn't been painted in years. The Blue Moon Bar and Grill was dark, but I figured I'd try my luck with Stella, the owner. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, Stella opened it, clearly not expecting visitors at this hour. I explained the situation, and she wasn't thrilled about letting a stranger in, but after a bit of back and forth, she agreed to let us in for coffee, though we wouldn't be staying long. I returned to the car to bring Mrs. Moore inside. Stella had the coffee ready, but Mrs. Moore barely looked interested. As she sat at the bar, I could see she was still trying to collect herself, clearly overwhelmed. Stella, ever the caretaker, asked if she was okay, but Mrs. Moore broke into tears again. Trying to lighten the mood, Stella joked with me, asking if I'd done anything to harm her, but Mrs. Moore, through her tears, managed to laugh, saying I was harmless despite my rough edges. Stella, always sharp, asked if Mrs. Moore was hungry. When she declined, I admitted that I could eat, and Stella offered some homemade soup. After a bit of back and forth with Stella, who always teased me, she finally served us both some soup. Mrs. Moore seemed to appreciate it, though her mood was still fragile. The conversation continued with some light-hearted banter, mostly aimed at me. Stella didn't hold back on poking fun at my Peter Pan attitude, suggesting that I hadn't quite grown up like my older brother JT, who she thought was the real man of the two of us. Mrs. Moore, who had been mostly quiet until now, chuckled at the exchange, but then she spit her soup out in laughter when Stella made a cheeky remark. It was a brief moment of levity, but it helped break the tension, even if just for a moment. As we talked, I could see that Mrs. Moore was slowly starting to relax. Despite everything, the warmth of the soup, the comfort of the conversation, and the small kindnesses were starting to help her regain her composure. By the time we left, I could tell she was feeling a little better, though she still had a lot to work through. Stella, ever the tough but caring woman, gave me one last jab about not being a real man in her eyes, but I knew it was all in good fun. As we left the bar, I had a sense that, for now at least, the worst of it was over. I couldn't help but laugh along with them. Nobody likes hearing hard truths, even when they know deep down they're accurate, especially when it stings. I laughed just to keep the mood light, even though I could feel the tension in the air. Stella, ever the gracious host, told us she was heading to bed but pointed out the coffee pot for us, then disappeared out the door without much of a goodbye. "Sweet lady," Mrs. Moore commented after Stella left. "Yeah, she's all right," I replied, feeling the weight of the conversation. "Come on, Lucas," she said, shifting gears. "You really are a womanizer, aren't you?" I chuckled, trying to brush it off. "Don't take that too seriously. I'm between wives right now, so people just assume that's the case." Her curiosity didn't stop there. "Are you?" I grinned, playing with the question. "Depends on what the definition of this is." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the kind that lingers just long enough for someone to say something serious, or break it with something ridiculous. I chose to let it hang there. She finally spoke up again. "I'm between husbands myself." She paused, her thoughts drifting. "If it weren't for my sister, I'd be home in the city alone with my computer right now." I could tell this wasn't something I was meant to poke at, so I kept quiet. She went on, her voice tight. "My sister's the reason I'm here. My other sister and I pay for the academy. We took Amelia in when she was 10, tried everything to help her, counseling, group programs, but nothing worked. Finally, we sent her here, hoping the school could make a difference." "Are they?" I asked, curious about the school. To someone like me, it felt like a world away, locked behind those high fences. "I don't know," she replied. "She hasn't run away in 6 months, so maybe that's something." "That's a good sign, if you say so." "So why the late-night drive through a snowstorm? Is everything not so perfect at the ivory tower?" I couldn't resist pushing a little. "You know, you're charming until you try to be witty," she shot back. She went on to explain that she was here because her sister had gone back to jail. The lawyer wanted Amelia to appear in court to make a good impression on the jury, but Mrs. Moore had other plans. "I'm not here to parade her around for a court hearing," she said, her voice firm. "I'm here to make sure she stays right where she is. I'm going to make sure my sister faces the consequences for once. She's slipped through the cracks for too long. It's time she answers for the mess she's made." "I wish you luck with it," I muttered, not sure what else to say. "Why do you think I'm wrong?" she asked, her tone sharp. "What difference does it make what I think?" I answered, genuinely confused. She didn't hesitate. "I don't mind giving my opinion. I just don't think you care about mine. You're just a country boy with a four-wheel drive." I could hear the underlying challenge in her voice, and I had to admit, she was probably right. "I'm beginning to think you're not just that," I said, my voice softening. She asked me if I thought her approach to her sister was flawed, but I couldn't see a fallacy in her logic. She'd tried everything else, and now it seemed like this was her last shot. "Jail won't help her," I said, trying to keep my response neutral. "But if you've spent this much money on her, you've done everything you can, right?" "We have," she sighed. "So, why the look when I mentioned Amelia? That school is about as cold as the hospital it used to be, and I'm not sure anyone there can actually help her." "She isn't insane," she said quickly, "but she is uncontrollable." I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "When was the last time you heard from her?" I asked carefully. "The last time we found her? She was 16, living in a motel near a Marine base, selling her body to survive." I was speechless. What could I possibly say to that? "Is she getting counseling there?" I asked, knowing little about the academy but trying to make sense of things. "They say they all get counseling," she replied. "And at the prices they charge, it better include some therapy." I paused, trying to gauge her response. "I suppose you're rich?" She raised an eyebrow, recognizing the question for what it was. "It depends on what the definition of is," I smirked, realizing she was giving me a taste of my own medicine. "Fair enough. So if this doesn't work out for Amelia, what's next for her?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Prison, I expect?" "Her grandmother will pull every string to keep her out of prison, at least for a while." She shook her head. "Thank God she's not into pills. Not yet, anyway." "Too bad I don't have a pocket full of pixie dust," I joked. "Maybe that would fix everything." "If you know what will fix it, Lucas, just tell me. I'll make it happen." Tears had started to roll down her face again, though they weren't the choking kind. It was as though she was all cried out, but the hurt still lingered. I stood up and refilled our coffee cups, having to microwave them since Stella didn't trust me with the coffee machine. It didn't matter. Fresh was fresh. "Look," I said, setting the cup in front of her. "This isn't about you and your niece, but I'm wiped. I need sleep. I'm going to sit in that booth over there and see if I can sleep sitting up." You're welcome to join me. At least we can be across from each other. Why not? She said, slipping into the booth opposite me. I barely had time to sip my coffee before I was out cold. I woke to the sound of the door rattling as it opened. Hey, Rosa, it's me, Lucas, I called out groggily. Rosa, always sharp, didn't miss a beat. What are you doing here? I know you're not robbing the place, I chuckled. Nothing worth stealing anyway. True. The food's good, though. She peered over at Mrs. Moore, who was still in the booth. Who's the lady with you? Her name's Moore, I replied. She's here to see her daughter at the academy across the street. Ran her car into a ditch, so I'm babysitting until they open. Did that no good JT rope you into this? Rosa didn't hide her distaste for JT. Yep, I said with a grin. But he's not here, so it's all on me tonight. Rosa just rolled her eyes, but there was a knowing smile on her face. Rosa was a respected member of First Zion Baptist Church, known for her involvement in its missionary work. She had 3 kids, but no husband, her marriage having ended years ago when her husband left her for a younger woman. This, along with her strong faith, had likely shaped her strong dislike for infidelity. I had tried to get some sleep, but Rosa's noise in the kitchen woke me up. Mrs. Moore, however, managed to sleep through it. Rosa cooked scrambled eggs the way I liked them, with cheddar cheese and sausage, no vegetables. It wasn't quite an omelet, but close enough. She served the eggs, and I grabbed coffee before heading to the booth. I offered Mrs. Moore breakfast, joking that I was treating her since she had all my cash. Mrs. Moore wasn't impressed, but agreed to eat. She mentioned that it was almost 8, and the kids at the school were probably already having breakfast. I teased her about leaving soon, and she responded by saying she was ready to be rid of me, not realizing I meant I'd be leaving after the meal. I made a joke about the eggs being rich with fat, and Mrs. Moore replied with some humor, claiming I'd only live to 99 if I kept worrying about health. We decided to head to the school, where Mrs. Moore wanted to visit her niece, Amelia. On the way, she apologized for being difficult earlier, and I brushed it off, calling it city girl paranoia. She asked me to wait for her at the school, and I agreed. I was heading home anyway, and I could drop her off at JT's place afterward. When we arrived at the school, we drove through the rear entrance, which was a converted hospital. Mrs. Moore explained that the front entrance wasn't used by parents, as the old lobby had been turned into a dining room. I joked about being born there, trying to lighten the mood, but Mrs. Moore only half laughed. At the door, we were greeted by a security guard who seemed confused by our arrival. Mrs. Moore identified herself, saying she was there to see Amelia. The guard checked the list but couldn't find her name. He seemed unsure of what to do, and when I stepped in, I was firm, stating that she was the legal guardian of the child and needed to see her. The guard was clearly frustrated, but hesitated before picking up the phone to call for verification. The phone call didn't go well. The officer on the other end told him that we'd have to return at 10. I wasn't having it, and made it clear that refusal to let us see Amelia would be considered false imprisonment, a felony. The guard looked taken aback by my response, and after some back and forth, he relented and agreed to get someone to bring Amelia down. Mrs. Moore and I waited, and I could see the tension in the air. It wasn't the best start to the day, but at least we were making progress. Celia and I were asked to wait in a small room across the hall while the headmaster was notified of our arrival. It was a quiet, somewhat awkward moment, and Celia quickly turned to me, asking who I was. I gave her a lighthearted answer, saying I was a part-time errand boy, which seemed to amuse her. After a half-hour wait, the headmaster, an older man with a receding hairline and a slight paunch, finally arrived. He greeted us, but when I introduced myself as a family friend, he seemed intent on having a private conversation with Celia. I wasn't having it, so I made it clear that I would stay. Celia backed me up, explaining that I wasn't just a family friend, but also her legal advisor, and she insisted I be involved in the discussion. The headmaster reluctantly agreed, and we followed him down the hall to his office. As we walked, I could hear Celia's heels echoing on the terrazzo floor. Once inside, the headmaster's demeanor shifted to one of concern. He admitted that he had told Amelia we were coming, but she had become upset, and to his surprise had gone missing. Celia immediately demanded answers, her voice rising in frustration. The headmaster explained that they hadn't seen Amelia since lunch the previous day, and her roommate confirmed she hadn't been back since. He assured us they were searching the building and grounds for her, though he seemed hesitant to call the sheriff right away. I could sense something wasn't right, and I pushed for immediate action, threatening to take legal action if they didn't involve law enforcement. Finally, the headmaster called the sheriff. As he made the call, Celia was overcome with emotion, her sobs cutting through the tension. I did my best to comfort her, but she couldn't stop blaming herself for leaving Amelia at the school. I reassured her it wasn't her fault and that we'd find out what had happened. While Celia cried, I asked her if she and Amelia had gotten along. She hesitated, but then explained that Amelia had always been difficult, willful, and disobedient, partly due to her mother's influence and the men in her life. I didn't press further, feeling it wasn't relevant at the moment. Before we could say much more, the sheriff arrived. The deputy, a man I recognized as Bubba, was somewhat dismissive of me, calling me out for being involved. He seemed to think I was out of my element, but I didn't let it bother me. He questioned Celia about her background, and she answered simply that she was from New York City. The deputy then turned to the headmaster and asked what had happened. The tension in the room was palpable as we all waited for answers. With her notepad in hand, Celia recounted the events, reaching the part about the car going into the ditch. She didn't try to cover for me at all. The deputy, clearly skeptical, turned to me. "You said you knew each other in New York?" he asked. I shrugged. "Well, Bubba, you could say that. Hell, you can say whatever you want." He wasn't done. "You said you were a friend of the family." "I never said how long I've been a friend," I answered coolly. Everyone stuck to their stories, including the security guard, who insisted he'd been at the door all night, watching for anyone coming or going. He said the alarms on all the other doors had remained silent. I drifted off as the deputy continued his investigation. "Lucas, you might as well head home," the deputy said after a while. "There's nothing more you can do here." I was about to leave, but then I stopped. "I think I'll stick around, just in case Mrs. Moore needs a ride." The deputy glanced at Celia, who looked exhausted. "Look at her, Hayes. She's dead on her feet. Take her to the motel out on the highway. Nothing's going to happen here until we find Amelia." He spoke quietly, but his words carried weight. "Check this place thoroughly. I think Amelia is still here. She didn't run away. Something happened to her here." I wasn't sure if the deputy was buying into it, but I was certain. "You should be careful," I said. "The snow covered any tracks. She's somewhere inside. You can bet on that." The deputy responded with pure sarcasm. "I'll keep your expert advice in mind." I just shrugged and walked away. Celia's exhaustion was clear. "You need rest, or you won't be any help when the time comes," the deputy told her. "Come on, I'll take you to the motel." Before we left, I wrote down my phone number on 2 cards, one for Celia and one for the deputy. Celia leaned on me as we made our way to the car. The road was still freshly plowed, but the snow was falling fast again. It wasn't a state road, so it would stay snowed in for a while, just enough for a 4-wheel drive to manage. I drove up the mountain, moving slower than we had the night before. The snowbanks lined the road, and my progress was sluggish. I was tired, but I had to keep going. "Do you want to check on your car with JT?" I asked, but Celia was too drained to respond clearly. She wasn't exactly in shock, but she was far beyond making decisions. "Lucas, I need to ask you a big favor," she said quietly. I knew what it was, but I pretended not to. "Of course, what can I do for you?" "I need sleep, but I don't want to be alone. Would you stay with me?" "You don't have to do anything. I just need someone here with me to keep my mind off everything." "You can come to my place. It's not much, but you're welcome to crash there." She smiled faintly, despite the grit on her face. "No thanks on the motel. I don't like staying in hotels or motels. I'm getting a bit antisocial." I saw a flicker of concern cross her face, but it was gone quickly. "It's up to you, but the cops know me here. You're not in any danger," I reassured her. "That was never my worry. My worry was that you might have a girlfriend." "I don't have a girlfriend right now." Her curiosity didn't stop. "So is JT really your brother?" "Yeah, he is. That's why you got a ride last night." She paused. "You could have said no." I smiled at the understatement. "Trust me, I couldn't have." She didn't know the full story. "Do you want to stop by or call from my place?" I asked. "I think I'll just call," she replied. I drove past the garage without stopping. She seemed distant, her gaze fixed on the snow as we moved along the road. When I turned into my driveway, I switched into a lower gear. The car climbed slowly, digging its way through the snow, but the little thing was tough. The house, though, looked weathered. JT and I didn't do much to the outside. We had agreed to leave it the way we remembered it, nothing fancy. It had been repaired and stained to make the new wood blend with the old, thanks to his wife's skill with stains. Celia's eyes showed a hint of concern as she looked around the house. Despite all the work I had put into fixing it up, it still resembled a shack. I tried to reassure her, telling her that it looked worse than it really was, and led her inside. The door, although looking like something straight out of a barn, was actually a hollow core steel door filled with insulation. The rustic appearance was thanks to Edna's paint skills, which gave it a charming, worn look. Once inside, Celia's expression brightened. It didn't take long for me to realize she shared my passion for technology. She moved through the room, inspecting the various computers scattered about. Meanwhile, I focused on getting the fire going. I had learned how to start a fire from scratch over time. The key was in the draft. A wide-open draft heated the crumpled newspaper, which then ignited the coal, creating a steady burn. As the room began to warm up, Celia seemed both amused and impressed by the older computers I had lying around. When she asked if I didn't have anything newer, I explained that I couldn't afford the latest tech. I had one fast computer for online use, but the others were outdated, though still functional. While the fire took hold, I told her to keep her coat on for a little longer as the warmth would soon fill the room. She asked why I called her Moore instead of her name, and I explained it was because, when we first met, she didn't want to tell me her name, so Moore just seemed to fit. She mentioned that Celia was a more traditional name and joked about how the nickname suited her better after all the emotional moments. I reassured her that everyone gets upset, and no one had ever called me a chicken for crying. She then turned the conversation to food, admitting she was hungry. I offered her some cold pizza, and to my surprise, she was a fan. As we ate, we avoided talking about Amelia, though the tension was palpable. During our lunch, I learned that Celia worked as a systems engineer at Citibank, though she didn't go into details. Neither she nor her sister had children of their own, and Amelia was the only child in the family. I didn't press her on why there were no other children, but she did mention that both her sister and her husband were lawyers. It seemed Amelia's mother was the only black sheep in the family, which sometimes happens when a child feels they can't measure up to their siblings. The pizza disappeared quickly, and the room warmed up. Afterward, Celia asked if it was all right for her to smoke indoors. I jokingly mentioned that the coal gases already filling the room would likely be worse for her health than the cigarette smoke. She smiled, lit her cigarette, and seemed perfectly comfortable. At one point, I interrupted her, recalling our earlier conversation about her being a health nut. She admitted she had been joking and explained she didn't usually eat meat. It wasn't about the cholesterol, it just made her feel strange. I teased her about being a mystery, and she laughed, noting that she could never predict how I would react to anything. I shrugged and replied that even if she spent a lifetime with me, she'd never know me fully. She mentioned that she doubted we would have a lifetime together, to which I responded that a lifetime could be as long as we needed it to be. She seemed surprised by my words, but I didn't elaborate. She asked again who I was, and I simply said I was just a country guy with some old computers. She seemed satisfied with that answer, though I got the sense that there was more to me than I let on. As the conversation shifted, she asked if I had running water, and I told her that I did, but the real issue was that I didn't have a functional bathtub. I explained that the area lacked a gas supply, so I never bothered installing an electric water heater. During the winter, I turned off the water to prevent it from freezing, and I used a large copper pot over the stove to heat water. It worked fine for me, but the small bathroom had a camper-sized tub, the only one that would fit. I gave her 3 ways to make it work, and she seemed intrigued but not shocked by the odd setup. The house was far from perfect, but it was home, and Celia seemed to appreciate that. As we continued talking, I could tell that she wasn't fazed by the quirks of the place. For her, the most important thing was not the setting, but the people she was with, and I suspected she was beginning to feel comfortable, even if it was just for a moment. I explained to Celia how the bathing process worked in my place. The copper pot on the stove was used to heat water, and if someone was small enough, they could take a bath directly in the tub. However, since I wasn't small enough, I had to improvise. I would stand in the tub, cover myself with water from a watering can, soap up, and rinse the same way. It wasn't ideal, but it got the job done. The third method, I told her, required 2 people who were comfortable with each other. One person would soak the other, lathering them up carefully, and then pour water over them to rinse off. It was the only way to truly replicate the experience of a shower, using fresh water throughout the process. Celia was intrigued, but asked how long it took for the water in the copper pot to reach a comfortable temperature. I told her that if left to heat on its own, it would take about 2 hours, though there were ways to speed it up in a pinch. She paused for a moment, then added that method 3 would certainly require people who were at ease with their bodies and each other. I agreed. Celia, however, wasn't at that level of comfort with me. She was clear about it, and I respected her honesty. I didn't expect anything more. especially given everything that had happened that day. As I plugged in the kettle to make some coffee, I offered her a cup, but she declined, agreeing that what we both needed was sleep. The situation was awkward, but I had to admit the lack of privacy in my small cabin was a bit of a problem. There was only one bed, and the sleeping loft had long since been turned into a storage space. Celia's logic was simple and practical. If she wanted to sleep alone, she would have gone to the motel. I didn't know what to expect, so I opted for a compromise, slipping into sweatpants while keeping my t-shirt and briefs on. I slid into bed, trying not to think about the fact that Celia would soon be joining me. When she did, she kept her distance at first, and I made an effort to forget that I was sharing the bed with an attractive woman. The exhaustion of the day soon took its toll, and I fell asleep. A few hours later, I woke with a sharp pain in my left shoulder. It was from Celia, who had unknowingly moved closer in her sleep, her head resting on my arm. Trying not to disturb her, I gently tried to remove my arm, but it wasn't possible without waking her. She stirred, half awake, and without saying a word, shifted even closer, pressing herself against me. Though the pain in my arm didn't go away, the warmth of her body made it feel almost insignificant. The soft fabric of her nightgown felt incredible as I lightly ran my hand up her back. After a few tender strokes, she pulled closer, and though I tried to stop myself, she kissed me, softly, gently. It was one of those rare, heartfelt kisses, full of sincerity and free of any games or hidden intentions. She sighed and pulled me closer, and for a long while we simply lay together. Both of us were still feeling the effects of a sleepless night, but the moment between us was comforting in its quiet intimacy. When it eventually ended, I lay beside her, exhausted, and soon heard her steady breathing as she drifted off to sleep. I followed her into a deep, peaceful rest. The sound of the phone ringing woke me up later. Celia was holding it, and I could hear the shrill chirping of the line. She handed me the phone, and I answered groggily. The voice on the other end was familiar, Deputy Bubba. He asked about the girl I had taken to the girls' academy earlier that morning. I told him she was here. As soon as I handed the phone back to Celia, she answered, and before long I could hear her fighting to hold back tears. The news was devastating. Amelia had been found, but she was dead. I held her tightly as she began to sob uncontrollably, her body shaking with grief. The snow outside had stopped falling, but the weight of the moment felt heavier than the storm. As she showered, I tried to occupy my mind. In the refrigerator, I found half a loaf of French bread and sliced off 2 thick pieces, preparing them to toast. With honey and real butter at hand, we had a modest but comforting meal. While we ate, Celia asked if I would be able to get the truck out. I smiled at her phrasing, but deep down, I had a feeling it wasn't going to be easy. When I reached the end of the drive, my suspicion was confirmed. The snowplow had created a massive wall of snow that blocked my way. Worse, the snow was packed solid, making it even more difficult to clear. I decided not to waste time trying to clear the entire driveway, and instead focused on creating a ramp by knocking some of the snow over. Miraculously, my plan worked. The truck, light as it was, managed to slide right over the snow. Celia seemed impressed, even in the middle of her grief. It was a small victory, but in a moment like this, it felt like something. When Lucas and Celia arrived at the school, they were greeted by a different deputy, Jack, who immediately commented on Lucas taking care of Celia. Though Lucas didn't appreciate the tone, he ignored it and moved on. Jack's questioning quickly turned to the case, asking Lucas if he had an idea who might be responsible for Amelia's death. Lucas didn't hesitate to lay out his theory. Amelia, he explained, had likely been involved with a man at the school. Given her manipulative and bold personality, she might have threatened him when she learned Celia was coming to take her home. It wasn't hard to imagine her confronting the man, possibly demanding marriage or making threats. The man, already in trouble due to his marital status and the illegal relationship, must have panicked. Lucas theorized that in a heated moment he liquidated her, either in anger or desperation. Jack listened, clearly surprised at how much Lucas had deduced. The deputy asked who Lucas thought the perpetrator was. Without hesitation, Lucas pointed to the security guard. He speculated that the guard had likely been disposing of Amelia's body when Lucas and Celia arrived earlier in the night, around 2 a.m. The pool of water Lucas noticed in the entrance hall that morning supported his theory. The snow must have blown in while the guard had propped the door open to move the body, bypassing the electric lock. Lucas suggested checking the computer logs to confirm when the door was unlocked. Jack, visibly impressed, admitted Lucas's deductions were spot on and decided to interrogate the security guard. However, as Jack passed Lucas, he couldn't resist taking a jab, asking if Lucas was clean. Lucas, offended but holding his ground, responded with a sharp retort. The exchange became heated, their mutual animosity clear. Despite the tension, Lucas held back, knowing Celia was watching. As Jack led the security guard away for questioning, Lucas felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. However, the sadness of Amelia's death lingered. The truth had been uncovered, but it was a hollow resolution to such a tragic end. Back in the car, Celia sat silently beside him, her hand resting lightly on his leg. The day had been long and emotionally draining, and she hadn't spoken much since they left the school. Yet, her quiet presence conveyed more than words ever could. Their shared experience had deepened their bond, even if the circumstances were harrowing. Breaking the silence, Lucas gently asked how she was feeling. Celia took a deep breath, gazing out the window. She admitted to feeling exhausted, but also mentioned that there was some sense of closure. While Amelia's death was devastating, at least the truth had come to light. She expressed a wish that things hadn't ended this way, but acknowledged that knowing what happened brought some small comfort. Lucas nodded, brushing his fingers lightly against hers. He agreed that the case had been a mess from the beginning, and while solving it brought clarity, it didn't undo the tragedy. Celia echoed his sentiment, emphasizing that exposing the truth was the right thing to do, even if it couldn't bring Amelia back. She found some solace in knowing the security guard was being held accountable, and that the headmaster, whom she initially suspected, was cleared of any involvement. As they drove, Celia reflected on Lucas's insight. She admitted that she hadn't seen the connection to the security guard until Lucas pieced it all together. He humbly explained that his deductions were based on observing the situation and understanding Amelia's behavior. Her confrontation with the guard had likely escalated to the point where he, fearing exposure and ruin, acted out in panic. Their conversation quieted again as they processed everything that had happened. The snow-covered landscape outside mirrored the somber mood inside the car. Though justice was being served, it was a bittersweet victory, leaving them both to grapple with the weight of what had been lost. The truth about Amelia's death was tragically straightforward. Her ambition and impulsiveness had driven her into dangerous waters. She had attempted to blackmail the security guard, demanding he marry her and threatening to destroy his life if he didn't comply. The confrontation escalated, and in a moment of anger and fear, the guard liquidated her. His clumsy attempt to hide the body, propping open the door and leaving a pool of melted snow in the entrance, ultimately exposed his guilt when Lucas connected the dots. "It's devastating," Celia said quietly, her voice heavy with disbelief. "I still can't wrap my head around it." Lucas nodded, his own tone subdued. "It's the kind of thing that sticks with you." The tension began to ease from his shoulders as they neared the motel. The long, grueling night had finally caught up to both of them. Celia couldn't help but feel grateful for Lucas's steady presence throughout the ordeal. He had been a rock for her, offering quiet support when she needed it most. As the car came to a stop, Celia turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said softly, "this past year has been rough, but through all of it, I feel like we've grown closer." Lucas looked at her, searching her face for any hesitation. "Yeah," he said simply. "I feel that way too." "You don't think this would push us apart, do you?" she asked, her vulnerability showing. He shook his head firmly. "No, if anything, it's brought us together." Her smile returned, gentle and full of warmth. "Good, because I've been thinking, maybe it's time to take the next step." Lucas blinked, caught off guard. "You mean—" She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Yes, I think we're ready, or at least I hope we are." Her words settled over him, filling him with a mix of surprise, gratitude, and determination. He realized then that he'd felt the same way for a while. "I think we are," he said, his voice steady. "I want this, Celia. I want us." In the days that followed, the case came to a close. The security guard, after being questioned by Jack, admitted to the murder. The evidence confirmed his confession. It was a crime born of panic and desperation. Amelia's death was officially ruled a homicide, and the authorities ensured the guard faced justice. A few days later, Lucas, Celia, and Jack gathered at the school to finalize the case. Jack, cigarette in hand, glanced at Lucas with a wry smile. "You called it," he said. "The guard. I don't know how you pieced it together, but you did." Lucas shrugged modestly. "Just paid attention. It wasn't too hard once I saw what didn't add up." Jack took a drag, exhaling a plume of smoke. "You know, you'd make a damn good detective." Lucas laughed, shaking his head. "I'll leave that to you, Jack. I'd rather stay on the other side of the badge." Jack chuckled, the tension between them easing. "I never thought I'd say this, but you've got a good head on your shoulders. And her, He nodded toward Celia, who stood a few feet away. She's something special. Lucas didn't hesitate. I know. Jack studied him for a long moment before flicking his cigarette to the ground. All right, Lucas. Don't go doing anything stupid. Lucas smirked. I'll try not to. As Jack walked away, Lucas turned to Celia. The weight of the past days began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of resolution. The case was solved, the truth was out, and justice would be served. More importantly, he and Celia had found strength in each other through the chaos. The future wouldn't be without challenges, but they'd face it together. And for Lucas, that was enough.